Hi everyone, thank you for joining. We'll give it a few more minutes to let others join.
Hello, people from Germany, Cape Town. Hello, hello. France, wow.
In Canada.
Australia, wow. Fiona, hi.
Perfect. Thanks, everyone. I think we're going to get started slowly just with our welcome and house rules. Welcome, everyone, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there for a second. Please let us know in the chat box where you're from so that we can give you a quick hello. But just from all of us, thank you all for joining. Just a little bit of our house rules. If you would like to ask any of our directors a question, please can you pop it into the Q&A box. You should see it at the bottom of your screen. There's a chat and then there's a Q&A. For the chat box, there is a small setting that you will need to change where it says to. You need to change that to all panelists and attendees so that you can interact with each other. Otherwise, we are the only people who can see your messages. So if you'd like to converse between each other, just have a look at that chat box setting. And then lastly, before we get started, your questions that you will be asking during this session and to those who submitted questions before we started, thank you very much. We are going to do our absolute best to answer all of your questions in writing. What we have done in the past is we've popped them all into a document, answered them in writing, and then emailed that document to all the attendees. So please don't feel disheartened if we don't get to your question this afternoon, and we will do our absolute best to answer it. So without further ado, I am going to introduce everyone here with me. First of all, I am Kath. I'm the Bloodlines Campaign Coordinator, and with me I have our 4 campaign directors, starting with Dr. Louise de Waal. She's our campaign manager and director, Nicola, Gerrard, Pippa Hankinson, and Ian Michler, who I'm sure need absolutely no introduction to those who are joining us today, who are fans and followers of Bloodlines. So I am going to kick straight off and hand over to Ian, who's going to chat a little bit about the history of the captive lion breeding industry. Thank you very much, everyone. Ian, over to you.
Well, thanks, Kath, and thank you to everyone who's joined us this afternoon, and in some cases this morning. So I think just before I give a brief overview of the history, I'd like to just make the following comments, because these are actually very important ones when you're trying to understand how these industries became so big over a period of time. And the first point to remember is that we're dealing here with very murky businesses. At the end of the day, these operators are mostly not particularly proud of what they're doing, and they understand that they are murky businesses. And so painting a precise picture of the history is actually problematic. It's very difficult to get good, precise information. The second thing is that we need to remember that the nature of this business, from the breeding and the can hunting through to the tourism industries, has actually morphed quite significantly over the last 25 years. And it's morphed in unison with the increasing pressure that has built up, initially from activists like myself and journalists, right the way through to the conservation community coming on board, the scientists, and then of course responsible tourism and bloodlines. And so it's changed significantly over the years. And it began merely as a commercial activity. That's what it was. People shooting lions or petting for money. And then, of course, the conservation economic justifications came in afterwards as the pressure built up. And so if we look at the history briefly, the earliest records that I can find of cub petting actually go back to the 1960s. And I have a very close friend and a colleague that I work with who sent me a picture not that long ago of him as a young child with his brothers holding cubs in a lion facility outside Johannesburg. The 1990s was a big era or period for when the actual can hunting and the commercial breeding started, and we know that from the CITES data bank. And so what started out as maybe a handful of animals a year suddenly went into a significant industry. And then I think 1997 was a highlight year with regards to the exposure internationally. So this was the first time that a visual narrative appeared of what actually was going on. Not only the brutality of it, but also the extent of it. And that was screened through the Cook Report in the UK. And that happened in 1997. I had started my own investigations a year or two before that. And so a lot of people were kind of horrified that this one particular lion and her cubs was shot in enclosed areas, but actually those had been involved understood already that this was an industry. Then 2001 was also an interesting year in the history. Kruger National Park underwent a transformation process and a commercialization process, and their whole management agenda changed. And a lot of the old apartheid era rangers, wardens, vets, helicopter pilot, all were retrenched. And many of them went into the private sector, and that gave the whole breeding and the wildlife ranching sector a massive boost. The next important stage was 2005, and that was the first time the government got involved and they tried to clamp down on these industries. And then Minister van Schalkwyk, Martinus van Schalkwyk, set out a panel of experts. And I was the author of an I4-funded report, quite an extensive report that went to the minister and his panel. And it was called Captive Breeding of Large Predators. And it was in that report that we estimated between 3,500 in captivity. 2007, the minister came out with his draft legislation and an attempt to end what they then called put and take hunts, which is the same word for can hunting. They don't use that term anymore, but back then it was put and take, as in these animals were taken from a captive facility and put elsewhere to be hunted. And that resulted in a court challenge from the industry. And so the minister won the first round. They then went to Court of Appeals, and that came out a little bit later. 2008 was also a standout year, and that was when we saw a significant increase in the lion bone trade. And then 2010 came the Supreme Court of Appeals, which overturned the original court victory for the Department of Environment. And this is what's interesting about this, is that the actual merits of the whole industry weren't really tested. The case was lost on a technicality because the panel of experts had decided that lions were either wild or they were not. And you could not rewild a lion that was brought up in captivity. And then the minister went and used this 24-month release time and said, well, if it spends 24 months in the wild, it can be shot as a wild lion. And the actual Court of Appeals referred to that as an irrational. They used that word, irrational. And that, folks, was the green light for this industry to take off in a big way when the government lost that case. And then, of course, we go on to bloodlines, which I think, Pippa, you're going to take over.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ian. Just handing over to Pippa, who's going to take us through a little bit of the the process from the Bloodlines release up until leading up to the high-level panel that was convened in 2019. Over to you, Pippa. Just unmute yourself, please.
Thank you, Kath, and thanks, Ian. Yeah, as Ian has so clearly shown, there's absolutely no doubt that international pressure around the whole captive lion breeding industry has been building for many, many years, and it's continued to gain momentum recently. And really, so much has happened in the last sort of 6 years that I thought I'd just cover just a few of those and give you a brief overview. So to start with, in 2015, we released the film Bloodlines, which we produced to provide us, and of course all our colleagues around the world, with a tool to continue the growing push towards ending the industry. And to create further global awareness, we launched the Bloodlines Campaign immediately after the premiere, which reached 11 million people in just 12 months. The same year we premiered, Australia took the lead in banning the import of lion body parts and derivatives, and this was closely followed by France and the Netherlands. And soon after that, US Fish and Wildlife tightened up on their permitting system, and also over 40 airlines began implementing embargoes on the transportation of hunting trophies. That same year, also in 2015, the Department of Environmental Affairs published their draft biodiversity management plans for the African lion, and that was for public comment. Adding more pressure, Motion 009 was adopted at the IUCN World Conservation Congress in 2016, calling on South Africa to terminate the hunting of captive bred lions, as well as captive breeding for commercial non-conservation purposes. The following year, the Professional Hunting Association of South Africa overturned their earlier decision not to support canned hunting, and this led to a major split in the industry, with several national and international hunting organizations, together with 3 of the world's largest hunting conventions, issuing statements. Many reports were published during this period, but in 2018, SANBI, which is the scientific authority, submitted a report to the minister in which they said that the intensive and selective breeding of game posed a number of significant threats to biodiversity at an ecosystem and species level. And then we went on to the Parliamentary Colloquium, which was one of the most important events of this time. It was a 2-day colloquium on captive lion breeding for hunting in South Africa.
Sorry, Pips, I'm going to interrupt you there. Your sound seems to have gone down quite a bit. There was a little bit of noisy feedback, and now your voice volume seems to have gone down. I don't want anyone to miss this next part because it's where it starts getting really interesting.
Can you hear? Is that better?
No.
On my side.
And now? Try again now, Pips?
Can you hear me?
No, it's actually worse now. No, can't hear. I don't know if, Pippa, if you want to take a moment, try and sort out your sound. Nicola, Ian or Louise, I don't know if you want to try and pick up from where Pippa left off, just to talk about the colloquium, or if we should just give Pippa a second to sort out her volume.
Well, okay, so I'll just quickly jump in there. So.
Thanks, Ian.
Yes, so after the Professional Hunting Association split, that was a big moment, because, and the split was, if I recall correctly, 64% of the hunters decided to side with the ethical understanding of what it meant to be a trophy hunter. And what was left were the 36% or so, which are regarded now as the canned lion hunters or the ranchland hunters. And then 2018, we had
Can you hear now?
Yes. There
Can
we
you
go.
hear me now? Oh, okay,
Yeah.
sorry, I just put in some headphones. Sorry, thanks, Ian, for taking over. I just wanted to wrap that up before you go on to that. The next one was that the portfolio recommended that the minister, and I'll quote, should urgently initiate a policy and legislative review of the captive breeding of lions for hunting and the lion bone trade with a view to putting an end to the practice. And these were adopted by the National Assembly 4 months later. And then in 2019, the colloquium was followed by a series of nationwide public workshops. And these were conducted by the South African Tourism Authority, SATSA, which concluded with the publishing of their captive wildlife guidelines, which were adopted by tourism organizations right around the world. And they clearly drew a line in the sand between activities which were found to be acceptable and those that were not, such as cub petting and lion walking. And then around the same time, in a groundbreaking court case between the NSPCA and the minister, together with the South African Predator Association, the High Court determined that South Africa's 2017 and 2018 skeleton export quotas were unlawful and constitutionally invalid. And the judge ruled, furthermore, that welfare had been ignored in setting the quotas, and that in line with Section 24 of the Constitution, the minister was required to consider welfare issues in all further decisions. By that stage, the minister or the then minister had already announced her intention to appoint a high-level panel to review policies, legislation, and practices around lion, elephant, leopard, and rhino management. And in 2019, she issued an invitation to submit nominations for the panel. And after receiving more than 90 nominations, the selection was finalized by Minister Creecy, who was minister at that point, and that was in October. And she appointed the advisory panel of close to 30 experts, including environmental lawyers, conservation leaders, scientists, tourism professionals, hunters, breeders, community leaders, ranchers, wildlife ranchers, economists, and a member of the IUC and Traditional Council. And over the next 14 months, the panel was tasked with 4 different duties. First one, reviewing existing policies, legislation, and all practices related to the 4 species, reviewing the implementation of the recommendations of the Committee of Inquiry, conducting public hearings and workshops, and considering submissions and scientific evidence and all other sort of forms of information gathering. And they were also required to identify gaps and make recommendations on the basis of the key focus areas. So the final high-level panel report was submitted to the minister in December last year, and on the 21st of April this year, the recommendations were approved by Cabinet. And so it pretty much brings me to the end of that period. But before I hand over to Nicola, I'd like to read Minister Creecy's very bold and all-inclusive statement, announcement, which she made, and it was just literally 11 days ago. The panel recommends that South Africa does not captive breed lions, keep lions in captivity, or use captive lions or their derivatives commercially. I have requested the department to action this accordingly and ensure that the necessary consultation and implementation is conducted. So although we know there's a very long road ahead, it was certainly a really momentous occasion for all of those people and around the world who've worked so long and so hard to hear those words. So thank you.
Thanks, Pippa. Yes, it was certainly a momentous occasion and one that I think we're all still kind of reeling from. So we're going to hand over to Nicola Gerrard now, who's going to take us over some of the majority recommendations from the high-level panel report in terms of captive lions specifically. Over to you, Nix.
Yes, can you hear me? Thanks, Kath. Thanks, Pips. Yes, so now we just get into the nitty-gritties of this report. It was about 600 pages, of which 8 or 9 were on lions. And we've done our best to summarize all of that. So just to start from that, the panel outlined a number of key points, or you could say issues, that have been stated over the years or campaigned for or against by a number of conservationists, welfareists, policymakers, tourism leaders. You know, there was a huge list of points that were recognized by the panel, which was really positive. We've pulled some of the main ones, and some of those are that the captive lion breeding industry captive lions and the breeding industry has no conservation value whatsoever. That the lions themselves cannot be rewilded, just, you know, remembering that this is a point that many of that the industry makes, where they say that to justify why they're doing this, because they're going to release them back into the wild. But obviously, yeah, we've campaigned for years to say that that's not actually possible. That the industry damages brand South Africa, as well as being a leader in conservation, damages that whole aspect, and that trade in lion parts poses a major risk to wildline populations. So those were some of the key factors that were recognized, which was really positive to see. Next slide there. Then the the key recommendations that came out of the report was the minister wants to adjust policy, to halt the sale of captive lion parts, to halt captive lion hunting or canned hunting, and then to halt the activities around interaction, so tourism interactive activities like cub petting and walking with. So yeah, next slide. So now we get, you know, this was a really interesting section of the report, which it really wasn't really covered by the media, and really interesting to get into this. Again, we've summarized as best we can. So this is how the majority of the high-level panel recommended to implement in order to end or to propose to end the industry. So some of these points here is to develop a minimum standard of welfare for captive lions, remembering that there's actually about 450 facilities across South Africa, so it's a massive task. To develop minimum standards for health and safety in the workplace, recognizing that there are zoonotic and safety risks with people in the workplace there. To change policy, to stop the trade in lion parts, to stop issuing permits for hunting of captive bred lions, to amend permit conditions to exclude tourism interactions, cub petting, and so forth. And then to continue on the next slide there, to amend permits to stop the breeding of lions and to require their sterilization, to prevent further breeding. We know that lions breed very, very well in captivity and in the wild, actually, if they've got space. But so that was an important point. To stop the issuing of permits, of captivity permits. So if there is a new breeder that wants to potentially start with the industry, no permits would be issued. To look at mechanisms to prevent stimulating illegal trade in lion parts of captive lions, and then lastly, to form a committee to look at a process for the ethical and humane euthanasia of captive lions. So we're running out of time, so I whisked through those, but I hope that I did that justice.
Thanks very much, Nicola. So if anyone has any questions just before we move on to more of the high-level panel report summary and recommendations, if anyone has any questions, please pop them in the Q&A box and we'll be getting to them in the next 5 to 10 minutes. I'm going to now hand over to Louise, who's going to have a look at more of the high-level panel recommendations and some points to monitor going forward. Thanks, Louise.
Yeah, I think, thanks, Nicola, that was a lot of information you had to squeeze in a few minutes.
Went really quickly, sorry.
I know, I just can't help it. I just want to share this. I actually printed the report. It's double-sided, it's still a doorstop. I'm still trying to get my way through it. Yeah, one of the things is obvious that from what Nicola was showing, that one of the things that is not being incorporated in that particular section on captive lions is actually the live exports. However, there is a recommendation specifically on the live exports of all these 5 iconic species. They talk about 5 iconic species, because it's both white and black rhino. And I think that is really quite important, because that shows the vision that I want to sort of look at in a moment as well, of the high level panel in terms of our wildlife. And that focus is on engaging with range states of those 5 iconic species to develop collective strategies for their conservation, including translocation. So it's kind of a move away from the commercialization of the wildlife and focusing on conservation instead. So in the live exports, the second recommendation is therefore that the minister should investigate, where necessary, prevent the export of live specimens of those 5 iconic species outside of their range states and into captivity in other countries. So it really is focusing on only export or translocation for in situ translocation conservation purposes. So I think that it's a really positive move to move away from this commercialization of wildlife and really looking at the conservation value. And again, with those recommendations, with every recommendation, there is a list of these sort of proposed implementation points. And I just want to highlight there that, again, they're saying that really we should be legislating that no individuals of those species would be exported from South Africa other than wild individuals translocated into appropriate and acceptable in situ conservation destinations in range states. And that is very strong in terms of their conservation purposes. So hopefully the live export to overseas breeders and zoos and the like in for example, Southeast Asia or in Europe should no longer be allowed, as long as obviously it's been legislated. And then there's a huge amount of information in this document, and for anybody, I see that Kath has actually shared the link to the HLP report, and you will see that there is a range of different recommendations made that are more generic, overarching recommendations that are not species specific. And that is kind of in line with the vision that the HLP has created, and in setting the scene for this report and all the recommendations within the reports. And I think that is quite important to look at their vision, which is secured, restored and rewilded natural landscapes with thriving populations of elephant, lion, rhino and leopard as indicators for a vibrant, responsible, inclusive, transformed and sustainable wildlife sector. So I think that can really set the scene for a lot of other species that were not part of their terms of reference, because their terms of reference was only those 5 species. Leopard, lion, elephant, black and white rhino. And when you look at the other recommendations, and I just want to mention a few before we kind of move on, is that they have this a real overarching and very wide-ranging vision of what South Africa should be doing with their wildlife. One of the things is a national biodiversity conservation and sustainable utilization policy. And again, they're very much focusing on promoting authentic and wild sense of place. They're talking about transformation of the wildlife sector, capacity building and skills training. So it goes beyond the sort of the species itself as well, and looks at people working within the industry. Setting minimum standards for animal welfare, improving the ineffectiveness of governance in the wildlife sector, especially when we look at this strange situation of 9 provinces and 1 national department. And really also there's a lot of recommendations in terms of South Africa and its reputation as a conservation leader and a leader in wildlife-based tourism. So I think there's a lot of very positives to take out. There are also some points that we will need to monitor, we will need to raise in time to come. And I'm sure a lot of your questions will sort of focus around some of those points as well. So far, I haven't really been able to see much in terms of definition. How do they define captive lions? Would that, for example, can captive lions be replaced by branched lions, or will the definition be so tight that it won't include branched lions? As I said before, their terms of reference was not really to look at other carnivores, whether they're endemic or exotic species. And yeah, we know that there's a lot of other big cats being bred in captivity as well. So there's some points for concern and points that we obviously need to monitor. Sanctuaries, rehabilitation centres, again, there has to be a very sound definition of what those are. So those are not going to be loopholes that the industry is going to jump on. There's a lot of talk of amendments to legislation, amongst other the NEMBA and TOPS legislation. And then also we need to continue monitoring the impact of the industry and also the phasing out of this industry on wildline population. So there's a lot of areas that need to be monitored, that need to be looked at, that need to be further investigated. There's a lot of work that still obviously needs to be done, but I think it's a very, very bold, very wide and encompassing report that the HLP has produced. Very impressive, and yeah, I think they need to be commended on the work that they've done over a fairly short space of time, and most of that year was actually under lockdown as well. So yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Louise. So I can see that there are a ton of questions coming in, both in the Q&A, on the chats, and on our Facebook live streaming. So if it's all right with everyone, I'm going to hop straight into those. And what I'm going to do to start with is kind of look at the most asked question, which I think we have been asking ourselves for a little while as well. So there have been a few people during this webinar and a couple of people before who want to know about the future of the lions that are currently in captivity in South Africa. And we have 1 or 2 questions asking about the path of euthanasia and whether that is the only feasible option. And what other options we have for these animals that are currently in captivity, whether that is euthanasia, rewilding, relocating, kind of where we stand in that. So I think I'm going to open it to all of us because I think we all have something valuable to say here, but I'd like to start with Pippa, if that's okay, just to give a little bit of insight into what we think is going to happen in the future. Just unmute yourself, Pips.
Yes, Kath, I think that sanctuaries are going to play a huge role really going forward with all of this. And what that role exactly will be, I'm not 100% sure. But what we do know as well is that there's only a handful of true sanctuaries and they are pretty much stretched to capacity at the moment. So it's going to be a tough one. I think the department is really, with their task team, is when they do the audit, they'll be doing a full audit across all the facilities, all the captive breeding facilities, and they will be appointing, by the sounds of it, they'll be appointing a task team which will be consulting, where wildlife vets will be consulting and monitoring the whole process. So it'll be very much up to them as to which animals can be saved and which can't. And that's where it's going to be a very tough call. But I think the fact that the vets will be part of that is very reassuring.
Thank you, Pippa. Anyone else? Thanks, Ian.
Yeah, Kath, I think it's very important to understand that, or to note that because there are concerns around what to do with 8, 10, 12,000 predators, is no justification to allow the industry just to continue. And I think from Bloodline's perspective, our number one priority has always been to end the exploitative commercial breeding. And so I think we start from that premise that because we have concerns around the predators, doesn't mean we just do nothing. That's point number one. Point number two is that, remember, all of these animals have been bred to be killed in can hunts, to be abused as petting animals, to end up in the bone trade. So we're talking about a far more humane way of dealing with them than they would have ended up if it had just been left to the operators. And then I think the third point is that when I started investigating in the 90s, there were less than 1,000, maybe 800 to 1,000 at the most of these predators, and on all species. When I submitted the report to Minister van Schalkwyk in 2005, there were now 3,000 to 3,500, and still no one did anything about it. When we did the research for Bloodlines, we came out with our 6,000 to 8,000, and no one did anything about it. More recently, there've been a number of research, updated research projects, including Lord Ashcroft's unfair game, and now they're talking about 12, maybe more. So clearly, if we leave it, the problem just compounds itself.
Yeah, if I can add to that as well, is that I think we know from within the industry that a lot of these animals are inbred. A lot of these animals are unhealthy due to all sorts of welfare issues the wrong kind of nutrition, inappropriate enclosures, etc., etc. We know that a lot of these animals are mentally and emotionally abused. So as Ian is saying, I think for those animals, and obviously that needs to be identified, those individual animals need to be identified by the experts. That needs to involve welfare specialists, that need to involve veterinarians. And I think those animals are better off to be humanely euthanized. How many animals that would concern, we don't know, because we need that. Therefore, we need an audit. We need an audit, an independent audit that can actually identify the number of facilities, what type of facilities, how many animals they have, and what type of species and what conditions these animals are in. That needs to be audited before those kind of decisions can be made. So we can have a guessing game in terms of numbers. We know roughly, we believe that there's at least 8,000 and maybe up to 12,000 lions in captivity. How many of those will need to be humanely euthanized? We don't know. And as Pippa started saying as well, sanctuaries will play a very large role in this as well, because hopefully we will have animals that can be rescued and who can be given a second chance. But you know, the number of animals that we have in true sanctuaries at the moment compared to the number of animals in the commercial captive lion breeding industry is just, there's just no comparison. So we need to be realistic as well. And personally, I also think that we need to start prioritizing in terms of sanctuaries with rescuing lions here in South Africa instead of rescuing even more lions from international destinations. but yeah, that's a personal opinion.
Thank you, Louise. So I just want to touch on another question that has been rolling into the chat box based off of this conversation. But first, I'd like to talk about one or two questions that we had come in, and I think we need to make this quite clear, is why these animals can't be rewilded. So this is why euthanasia would be on the table. It's not the first option, it's not what any of us want, but we need to talk about why these animals can't be released into protected areas and be allowed to fend for themselves. So Nicola, you've been very quiet. I'm going to bring you into the spotlight and ask you to please chat about the rewilding.
Thank you, Kat. So yes, it's a good question. It's as the HLP has recognized that, unfortunately, you're sitting with about 12,000 lions now that cannot be rewilded. As mentioned before, they've been part of a commercial breeding cycle. They've been born into captivity. They've been removed from their mothers. They've been bottle fed. They've been habituated to humans. They've been inbred. They're sort of genetically tarnished. They've lost their fear of humans. If they would simply, if they were to be released into a wild space, they wouldn't survive. They wouldn't be able to hunt. They wouldn't really know how to hunt on their own. They'd be killed by wildline prides or other predators, hyenas. They also might sort of eventually die because they're not genetically strong. And they've been tamed. There's no sort of other way around that. And I think what people need to realize is that when wild lions have enough space, so when they're in really nice protected areas, they've got enough space, enough habitat, wild lions breed very, very well in the wild. So, when we're looking to repopulate or to translocate lions, we're going to take lions from, or the conservationists, should I say, are going to take lions from other wild populations. Captive bred lions are not recognized as a source population to further spread into other areas. So that is why, that is why they simply can't be rewilded. Did I get that right?
I think also on top of all those reasons why we can't actually rewild a lot of these captive bred animals, also they're physically often not as strong as their wild counterpart, is we don't actually have enough wild safe habitat to actually release them into.
Yes.
Because a lot of our smaller fenced reserves, they're up to capacity when it comes to lions. And I don't think that some of our national parks could take them either. So even all those reasons that Nicola has given, would not be there. We would not actually have enough safe habitat in South Africa. We would have to start looking a lot further afield. And then you get into all sorts of difficult situations where, the genetics might not be quite right, etc., etc. It's just, safe wild habitat is scarce as well. So that comes on top of it. So the logic then is, and we're sitting here with a huge number of animals, a lot of them not very healthy. They can't be rewilded. So what do? We just from a financial point of view, you could not put 10, 12,000 lions into a sanctuary and give them a second home until the end of their lives. They could still be living, 10, 15 years. That's a huge cost element. And I don't think any of the sanctuaries could even start to consider taking a huge number of animals on board, because financial stability and financial sustainability for a sanctuary is hugely important too.
Definitely.
I
so
think,
that's go for it, Ian.
I think it's important to tell everyone that step number one would be to stop the breeding. So, and I think the minister understands that and has accepted that. So that would be your number one step, is stop all breeding. And that, of course, puts a timeline on the issue, because we know that lions live, 12, 15, maybe slightly longer in sanctuaries. And that's the duration of the time frame, to stop all the breeding. And then the other quick point is that I think everyone should understand that this is not Bloodlines who has decided, the way Nicola's outlined very clearly why these animals have no conservation value. This is the work of the conservation community, the legitimate lion scientists, the lion ecologists. They are the ones that have told us, that have told the minister through their submissions, that these animals have no conservation value.
Definitely. That's almost exactly what I was going to say. So you took the words right out of my mouth. Thank you, Ian. So we have now spoken about that, the unpleasant topic of what's going to happen to these lions in captivity. Now I think it's a good point to move on to wildline populations, which is another question that has been coming in a lot before this webinar, and now during, while we've been talking in the chat and in the Q&A and on Facebook as well, is the demand is not going to go away overnight. We know this. And I think we need to make this clear to our followers and supporters, is we know that this industry that has taken 20 years to build is not going to take one day to take down. But I'd really like to ask Louise if we can chat a little bit about wild lion poaching, and whether there's any inkling in the high-level panel report and any mentions of the effects that this might have on wildline populations.
Yes, and there is more and more evidence becoming available that the industry and the trade in lion bones and lion derivatives is actually having an impact on wild lion populations. One good study to mention is Panthera's study that looked at Limpopo National Park in Mozambique, where which was a fairly small population, about 100 if I'm not mistaken, and where a significant number of lions were poached, and was to the detriment of the population for their paws and their teeth. Now those sort of lions, very often their carcasses can be found, and you can see why they're being poached, because their paws and their faces are being hacked off, which is obviously a horrendous way to die. We had that case not so long ago in Uganda as well, where about, I think, 6 or 8 lions were killed for that same purpose. So yes, there is definitely a growing a bulk of evidence becoming available that this has a definite impact on wildlife populations. And of course, people would argue by taking away the captive industry and the captive bred lion bones, that it could have a bigger impact on poaching in the wilds. Now, that's always a argument that is being used by people who are pro-sustainable utilization, but we also know that illegal trade actually stimulates an illegal trade as well. The end producer does not know whether a lion bone has been obtained legally or illegally. So that is not really an argument to continue the trade either. In terms of whole skeletons, that's always very difficult, because those animals will disappear altogether. We know that lion populations across Africa are declining, or have been declining hugely for the last 20 or so years. So part of those lions is obviously habitat loss and the loss of prey species and those kind of threats. The poaching for bones and body parts is definitely one of those threats as well. And the HLP has definitely identified that as a significant impact of the industry on wild lion populations.
Thanks, Louise. Does anyone else have anything to add there in terms of wildline populations and poaching? Nothing. No, that's perfect. So I think it is a difficult one to answer. We are kind of moving into a new space. Everyone is moving into a new space, both the NGO sector, the conservation sector, and the breeders and keepers of lions. So it's all going to be a new road that we need to travel, and we need to travel it together, I think. And we need to move these points forward. So just we are coming to.
Sorry, Kath. I just wanted to say, I can just see the comments sort of going through here, talking about this important topic. And I think talking about genetics, talking about monitoring wild populations, it's important to note, for those that don't know, that there are a number of NGOs and that doing research on a lot of these issues. For example, someone mentioned here, EWT has got a lion database that they're working on and monitoring that as well. So there are some conservation leaders that are certainly know about these key issues that are on it.
Definitely.
Yes,
thanks, Nicola. We're not alone.
Yeah, and that needs to be monitored very closely into the future as well. Absolutely. Definitely.
So I think our next point of call is the legislation, and not only how these recommendations are going to be translated into legislation, but something I want to touch on very quickly before we move on to that is we've had a few questions about the reclassification of the wildlife species as farm animals, and how this change by the Department of Environment is going to impact on that. So I'm not sure really who would like to pick that up. I'm going to leave it to you. Perhaps Louise, I think you can maybe comment on it, and then Ian, Pippa and Nicola, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, I think what has been recognized by the HLP is that there is this disjoint, sorry, I'm not expressing myself very well. So part of the mandate lies with agriculture. Agriculture has adopted some of these species in their Animal Improvement Act and the Meat Safety Act, which falls under the mandate of agriculture. Welfare, that has been mandated under agriculture for many years, and then the species in its own right and a lot of the legislation around TOPSI and NEMBA all fall under environment, which is a very strange division of those mandates, or of a same species between different departments. And I think what the HLP has recognized that, and they have also recommended that better channels of communication need to happen between those departments. Those departments can no longer sit there and work in silo. I think it was the Meat Safety Act, if I'm not mistaken, that was amended without even the minister and the Department of Environment knowing. They weren't even consulted on that. So I think there has to be much better channels of communication between those two departments, working together and making sure that they're not working against each other in terms of legislation that is being put in place.
Thank you, Louise. So if these high-level panel reports, the recommendations are somehow going to be impacting previous legislation, can we talk a little bit about permitting? We've had a very interesting question come through asking if the permits to keep, breed and transport and hunt these lions lies with the provinces, how is the national government going to be overcoming the obstacle of getting these provinces to be complicit in the new national law. So I know we've always spoken about the 9-1 issue that South Africa has with the 9 provinces and the one national government and how they interact with each other. So can we talk a little bit about how the high-level panel recommendations are going to ensure that the provinces will keep up their end of the bargain?
Kath, I think what's come out very clearly in the report is that government is changing the terms of all the permits. So, and whether that will then be implemented at national level and not at provincial level remains to be seen. I'm not sure, Lou, if you came across that, but they've a number of times they were talking about amending the permitting system. Lou, have you got any further that you saw?
Yeah, also, I think one of the things that they're calling for is a national-wide electronic permitting system. So it's more centralized. They are definitely recognizing the inefficiencies of this 9-1 and that some of the provinces don't actually even adopt TOPS as legislation. So changes need to take place to improve that and improve governance around that. It's definitely very clear from this report that there is an issue. We know that all. We've seen it. I think in practice, it's going to be quite difficult how that is going to happen. I don't know, because what we have started realizing, it's not even just the provinces that are issuing permits. It actually goes down to district level within the provinces. And often the provincial authorities don't even know exactly the state of play within their own province. So yeah, I think there is a lot of the department and the provinces will really need to have a very close look at themselves and how things are being organized in order for this to actually work a lot better. And that includes the permitting as well.
Yeah, and Lou, what we do know is that all new permits have been stopped forthwith. So nobody can set up a new sanctuary, at least a new facility, breeding facility, or keep lions or anything like that. So that's with immediate effect. I think that was my take on it anyway.
However, that is very true, because it does say, you know, at least with new permits that should not be issued any. Provinces should not be issuing any new permits for any new entrants into the industry. However, whether that has been communicated to the provinces, I don't know. When this whole process is actually starting, when provinces are being told this is what you're supposed to do, I don't know. That is all still not very clear.
I think, Lou, we can point out, though, that in the minister's speech on the Sunday, she made it quite clear that she used the word immediate on a number of occasions. And so, you know, in accepting the recommendations, she spoke about immediate instructions going down the chain to her department and the provinces to start certainly working on policy. So I think at the end of the day, time is going to tell, but I think a lot of this will depend on the will of the minister and the committees that are working with her to implement this.
Definitely. We've had a question come in from Edith. Are permits renewable, and will the ban on new permits affect renewals? I'm not sure if there's been any mention of that in the report, but it's something that I was wondering myself. They only really refer to new permits, but will those who currently hold breeding and keeping permits, will they be allowed to renew?
I think it was amending. It was amending. They were amending to not to basically ban.
That is my understanding as well, that a lot of the permits in terms of hunting, in terms of breeding, in terms of tourism attractions, those will all be amended. So obviously when there is a renewal, that is a great place to start in terms of amending the conditions of the permits. And that is my understanding, that the amendment of the conditions of the permits will be changed, and obviously if a permit is up for renewal, that is an ideal place to do that.
Perfect. So if we now are not renewing and we're not allowing new permits, what is going to happen to these breeders and keepers of big cats that have these animals on their properties and are assuming in the process of perhaps starting a new property? Ian, can I ask you to please comment on what we think and where we stand in terms of the future for breeders and keepers of big cats?
So yeah, so I think again, it's too early for us as Bloodlines and anyone actually out there to be coming up with precise and exact answers. I think this is all going to be determined in terms of how the policy gets formulated. It'll also be determined by the committees and the experts that the minister gets around her to actually implement what she's trying to achieve. So you know, the vets, the conservation agencies, the welfare people involved, the lion ecologists, once they do this audit, they will be able to determine not only, you know, how many predators there are and the conditions that they're in, but also of the facilities that are holding predators, what percentage of them are in a fit state to be able to do that properly. They have the funding to do that, or even have the will to do that. And I think that audit will determine how many are asked to be closed, you know, within a time frame that's set by those experts. Others will be asked to maybe take care of lions that can be moved from facilities that are in no fit condition to be keeping them. So these are all the issues that will be dealt with by the experts and through the ministry in the implementation phase. And again, as I say, you know, it's probably too early yet to put any definite parameters on it. My suspicion is that a lot of these facilities will end up being closed down because they are nothing more than commercial outlets, and they're not true sanctuaries. And a lot of them, their lions or their predators are in really poor condition. Others will not have the will to carry on if there's no revenue streams. But that will all be determined in this process of implementation.
And Ian, to add to that, a lot of the breeders we know are farmers as well. So this is kind of a sideline for them. So very, very possibly they'll revert back to agriculture.
Yeah, and as soon as this process has started and because the minister has also said pretty immediately no permits will be issued for count hunting anymore. So there's no count hunting, you can't breed, you can't interact with the cubs, you take away, and there's no bone trade, you take away basically all of the income. And these animals then just become a cost to the owners. So I think a lot of the people will just want to close shop and as Pippa says, go back to more traditional farming methods, which they did before they started diversifying into a lucrative sector.
Definitely. So before we start winding down, I just want to make a quick comment, if I may. We've had another question just about this decision being contested in court, and we know, we are quite clear that it will be contested in court. We know this. I think someone else made a comment that SAPA has already indicated that they will be taking it to court. So this again adds to the comment that it's not going to be an overnight thing. It's going to be a long road, but we all need to kind of go this road together. So I think it's quite clear that we all have a lot of questions, not only, you know, our followers and supporters who are watching, but ourselves. We have a lot of questions with regards to implementation, phase out, timeframes. So we don't have all the answers as much as we'd love to have all the answers for everyone. We can just keep doing what we're doing and educate the public and try our very best. So I think we are now out of time, so I'm going to hand over to everyone for a little bit of a closing remark from each team member. Ian, can I start with you?
Yeah, so I think I would just like to close by saying that, you know, while Bloodlines has been a significant and a very high-profile public platform, an umbrella, if you like, that's driven this global campaign through the launching of the film, we've had many partners, supporters, and collaborators during this process. And at the end of the day, it was these people, these professionals, these expert voices that gave submissions to the panel, to the high-level panel, that actually allowed the minister to make this decision. And I think I'd like to just spell out for our followers that we're talking about here the wider conservation community. They came to the party, the wider, the legitimate conservation community. They supported the film and the campaign. I also want to speak about the lion scientists and ecologists, the legitimate lion scientists, not only here in Africa, but also in other parts of the world. They supported the film, they supported the campaign, they supported the ban on lion bone trade, and made it clear there's no conservation value. Then the entire welfare agencies, including all the vets. We had the responsible tourism sector that came to the party through the SATSA guidelines. We had over 200 tourism operators around the world sign the Born to Love Wild pledge. So they came as well. We had the legal fraternity, played a significant role in all of this. There have been politicians and activists all around the world that have stood up with Bloodlines, the film and the campaign, the airlines, and I can go on. And I think the important point here is that this community also needs to be recognized as they've played a significant role. And my appeal to them is to stick together. We're now in the majority, and if we can do that, we're going to form a very powerful lobby to push the minister's recommendations into law.
Thanks, Ian. Pippa, I don't know if you want to give a closing remark.
Just really, I echo everything that Ian has said, and really to thank everybody who's been involved in this process. And yeah, we know it's going to be a long road ahead, but we just look forward to working with all our partners that we've worked with in the past and to supporting the process going forward.
Nicola? Anything?
Very short. Absolutely agree with what Ian and Pippa are saying. We are here, still a long road. We're still here to fight it, and we'll be here as long as we can to try and get that done. As Ian said, it's all about collaboration and our partners. We wouldn't have been able to get this far without them. So absolutely.
Thanks, everyone. Louise, I'm going to hand over to you to close up this webinar. Just from me, thank you very much, everyone, for all of your questions. I think we have our work cut out for us over the next few days as we try to answer everyone's extremely valuable questions. We could sit here on this webinar for days and chat about all of this, but unfortunately we only have a small amount of time, but we'll get to everyone's questions in writing. Thanks, Louise.
Thank you, Kath. Yeah, and thank you, Pippa, Ian, and Nicola. I think there's not really an awful lot I can add to that. I have to say, you know, we as Bloodlines, we do commend the minister on this very bold move to phase out this industry. As Pippa said, it's going to be a long and it's going to be a bumpy road. It's going to have some really tricky and challenging decisions that will need to be made. I think it also opens up doors with huge collaboration between lots of different experts and sectors and NGOs. And I think we just need to make sure that we continue to talk with a united voice. Yeah, along that long and bumpy road, we need to keep in mind that we have that long-term vision that we've always had to end this industry, and that is for the greater good of lions. You know, no more lions in captivity in South Africa means no more suffering. We have extended our support to the Minister and her department in the process going forward, which is an offer that will remain open. And I think there is a lot of people in different sectors from different walks of life that would echo that and are there to fully support the Minister and her department in this quite onerous task ahead. Because yeah, if they really want to implement all the recommendations in this HLP report, that's yeah, quite a task ahead, and it's going to take quite a bit of time. So I think we also all need to be patient. This is not going to change overnight, although we would love to see it happen overnight. You know, don't get us wrong, but I think we all need to show some patience in this long process as well. So thank you all so much for being here with us. And yeah, sorry if we haven't been able to answer all your questions or not being able to give definite answers, but that is really where we are at the moment. We've got a huge opportunity here, but how this is going to pan out in reality and in practice, we just are not 100% sure on ourselves. So yeah, it's just looking ahead and staying positive and working together. Thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Yep. Thanks to everyone. Thanks for all the support.
Thanks everyone. Bye.
Thanks everyone. Bye.
Bye.